Hello, and welcome to a British Cartographic Society Teatime Talk. My name is Chris Tributus, BCS Vice President and today's Chair. Today we have a talk from Justin Coulson, and he'll be giving a talk on layers of London, bringing together the overlapping layers of experience and community heritage through web mapping. I'll now hand over to Justin for the talk.
Thanks very much, Chris. I will just share my screen. Okay, everyone. So I'll just start by introducing myself and perhaps, as is often the way, beginning with a little bit of a caveat. So I'm Justin Coulson. I'm Senior Lecturer in Urban and Digital History at the Institute of Historical Research, which is part of the School of Advanced Study, which is part of the University of London. And I'm not a geographer and I'm not a cartographer, but I am a historian who practices what we call spatial history or spatial humanities. I actually originally trained as a late medievalist, and I've strayed progressively further into map history as I've gone along. The other caveat I'll make is that I'm talking about a project here that I've only been involved in after its funded phase. So a lot of the things I'm going to be discussing here are to do with the evolution and growth of the project and its origins, which I wasn't directly involved in. So I think there's actually quite a few advantages to that, being able to reflect on that process slightly dispassionately. And also there might be some questions about the early phases of the project and decisions made during development of the project that I might not be able to answer quite so well. So here we go. What am I talking about? Talking about Layers of London is a project that has been run by the IHR, by the Institute of Historical Research, now since 2017. It's a web-based project. You can all access it at layersoflondon.org. And I'm going to talk you through some of the aims of the project, some of the things that you will find on it, but perhaps more importantly, how we went about bringing together a set of resources and an infrastructure for place-based history in London. This is a quick preview of the site as it looks today. I'll return to some of that functionality with some live demonstration as we go along, but I'll start by explaining the context. So Layers of London was a National Lottery Heritage Fund funded project. And it had quite a broad range of aims. First and foremost, and I think perhaps of most interest to this audience, was to bring together digitized historic maps and geographical data from a range of archive and heritage partners, from Historic England, from various libraries in London, including the Guildhall Library, London Metropolitan Archives, and as many of London's borough councils as we could possibly involve. But in parallel with that aim is equally importantly an aim to enable content creation by crowdsourcing. So being able to bring in the community, to enable community to participate in that process of creating an archive of digital historical maps, but also to contribute their own content, their own images, their own stories, their own interviews, videos, anything they would like to add to the map. So it's not simply a cartographic resource, it's a heritage resource much more broadly. So by bringing together all of these different elements, by bringing together the historical maps, by bringing together the different communities' shared heritage collections, we really wanted to bring together, use the map as the nexus, as the point where different communities might discover each other's understandings of often the same spaces. And that's very much the idea behind the title, Layers of London. It's a playful title. It's intended to convey not only map layers, but layers of experience. As I mentioned already, we had a broad range of partners. Our main funder, but not our only funder, was the Heritage Fund. We're funded to the tune of about 1 million over 3 years for the core of the project. We had some key content partners, but partners who also took part in the project through, for example, hosting internships for students and hiring extra curators and conservators to do work on map collections. So obviously that included the British Library with some of the, especially the 18th and 17th century maps, which are on the website. Museum of London Archaeology, who provided geoinformatics support for us and did an awful lot of the behind the scenes work, geocoding, georectifying those historical maps. Historic England provided all of the RAF post-war aerial photography for the London County Council area, sorry, actually the Greater London area, which was the basis of our volunteered crowdsourced georeferencing tasks. National Archives provided the Inland Revenue maps from the 19 teens, and some of our academic partners were hosted at Birkbeck. London Metropolitan Archives, now the London Archives, under the City of London, provided an awful lot of content to us as well. And there we are. We are the Institute of Historical Research, which is part of the University of London, and that's the Central University of London, which is actually very, very small. You're probably much more familiar with King's College and University College, for example, who are our federation partners, but we are the central coordinating brain at Senate House in Russell Square. So how did we come to do a project like this? Well, we can certainly see it as part of a trajectory of place-based research that historians at the IHR, at our former Centre for Metropolitan History, have been following over many decades, really since the 1970s. There'd been a particular focus through the historiographical trends of the 1970s and 80s to focus on social economic change, economic growth, health and disease, especially distribution of plague and things like that, through understanding the urban form and mapping property values, mapping distribution of disease in earlier periods. So we had a whole succession of large funded projects from the 1980s onwards. The social and economic study of medieval London was an absolutely vast project which catalogued in immense detail all of the property deeds for every property on Cheapside in the centre of the City of London for at least 500 years. That was initially funded by Barclays and later by the Economic and Social Research Council. And then other projects which continued to get further and further into thinking about London's history through a geographical lens. But this project, Layers of London, took a very different approach. From about 2010 onwards, lots of projects were being funded in history based around the use of historic maps and historic geographical data in different forms. From 2011, the most influential of these was a project called Locating London's Past, which fully georeferenced John Roke's 1746 map of the cities of London and Westminster, and then used that to geocode a huge amount of data, for example, from the records of the proceedings of the Old Bailey. So you could search, and this website has just been updated itself. You could search different types of crime, victims of crime, offenders of convicted offenders, acquitted offenders, etc., and view their distribution over time across the City of London, geocoded onto the streets of the 18th century, rather than using modern address data to locate that. There were other projects. Bomb Site, it took World War II bomb impact locations and coded those as points from a variety of different sources. But there wasn't really a consensus around this time of how to approach working with historical maps and historical map data of London. So amongst those of us who work on earlier periods, a very influential site has been the University of Victoria in Canada, their project called the Map of Tudor London, Map of Early Modern London, where they took the copperplate map, or in fact the woodcut map, the AGAS map, and scanned it very high resolution, made it clickable, interactive, but didn't try and conform it onto a modern geographical framework. And historians have very much enjoyed using that as well. But there seemed like an awful lot of duplication of effort. Each one of these projects was creating its own custom website that was creating a lot of maintenance and infrastructure commitments, which universities aren't really set up very well to deal with, as well as approaching the questions of how you deal with a past geographical framework differently each time. So part of the intention was to pull together these different resources and come up with a better solution. So skipping forward a bit, where are we now? What has Layers of London achieved? Well, we had those 3 years of funding from 2017 to 2020. And we have continuity funding for at least another 5 more years. So it's actually 1 more year at this point. We have collected around 12,000, I think now actually 14,000 user contributed records, map pins, which have been submitted by members of the public who can register with a very minimal amount of data and upload their own stories, memories, and especially photographs. We've got more than 400 what we call on the site overlays. They're essentially raster layers generally, ranging from 16th century through to the mid-20th century. As much coverage of the entire Greater London area as possible. We got 18 of London's 34, if you count the City of London, borough archives to contribute in the end. And it was interesting, actually, that even though we were offering them free money and free resources, many of them didn't have the capacity even to facilitate the work that we were going to pay for them in terms of digitalization. But one of our other big successes was working, rather than with the university IT department, with a external agency. Originally, they were known as Error Agency. And they developed a custom platform, which became Layers of London, which they have seen as so successful that they have now commercialized as a platform available for other arts and humanities focused projects to use, and they call it HUMAP, Humanities Map. And that's been licensed to many other academic projects, to universities around the globe, and interestingly to a lot of publishers of digital resources. So we now have a very mutually beneficial arrangement with them, whereby they continue to provide us maintenance, and they use us as a bit of a selling point. I'll just switch to the live version of the website now, just to give you a little demonstration of how it all works. So at layersoflondon.org, and you arrive at a splash screen. Sometimes people find this a little bit confusing, that you first have to click explore the map. And here we go. So we've got some sort of suggested starting points opening in the panel on the left-hand side to begin with. Got the main navigation down the left-hand side. And then we can see the map here, which is obviously just a standard OpenStreetMap for now, but we can see the grouped points of the numbers of pins and records that we can find in any one of these locations. I'm now just clicking on things randomly, and we'll see what we find. A very insightful comment there from Alan, who thinks St James's Park is a favourite place to see the birds. Huge amounts of stuff there. From some of those numbers, you'll have seen just how many things are found in any one place. So most people would navigate these records using search. or in fact browsing the records in a given area, and especially browsing through collections and through trails. So trails allow students and any member of the public to create a narrative. This is actually from a partnership we did with the charity Everyday Muslim, who were working through some very rare archives of mosques. The thing that's probably going to be of most interest to many of you here, I suspect, though, are the overlays. If we access via the pretty universal diamond stacked there as layers symbol, we can access all of the overlays which are in the area which you currently have visible at a given time. So here is Roke's map of Westminster and Southwark. And again, this is perhaps a little bit of a gotcha that people don't always see straight away. You have to click the yellow use this overlay before it appears. Now we can zoom in and we can see that this has now been overlaid conventional georeferencing form onto the map. We can click hide pins to hide all of that. You can use the arrow there to make this full screen. You might notice it looks a bit different. There's a lot more color than you might expect from a mid 18th century map. This is because this map has also been fully vectorized. So all of the streets, administrative boundaries of wards, of parishes, and everything like that have been traced by the Museum of London Archaeology Geoinformatics team, and are therefore available to search, to click, to navigate, to retrieve the data of as you work around. You can use show overlay tools, which pops out from the bottom, to show or hide those. So perhaps if we only want the roads, you can find everything here that was annotated with a number or a code on the original map is available to view there. And I'll talk in a moment about the value of that. Of course, you can turn that off and then just view the historical map itself. And you can use transparency to make comparisons. And you can, of course, load as many of these as you like to play around with transparency, make changes, comparisons as you move along. So I'll switch back to the PowerPoint now. So that georeferencing is perhaps for academics and for people interested in maps, particularly the kind of the heart of the project. It was interesting to look at the maps and the collections which were have had most hits, most visits over the last few years. By far the most popular has been the Historic Towns Trust's reconstruction map of Tudor London in 1520. So that's a map made originally in the 1970s by regressing the Ordnance Survey maps of the 19th century to create a spatially accurate map of London circa 1520. And as you can imagine, that's particularly popular. That featured in some of the reporting that you might have seen recently about the Civilization 7 game. And how they've been using inspiration from this to think about how cities will change and how that will be represented in the game. The bomb damage map, famous London County Council bomb damage map, compiled during the Second World War with the colour coding of the different levels of damage. It's exceptionally popular on the site. Ordnance Survey maps are, of course, very popular. These are the same versions that you will find on the National Library of Scotland site, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, maps.nls.uk. They partnered with us, and all of their Ordnance Survey maps of London are also available via Layers of London. Charles Booth's poverty map of 1886 was also exceptionally popular. Again, it's a colour-coded copy of an Ordnance Survey map, but where social researchers in the 1880s color-coded each property by the social class of the people who live there. And then we have this whole collection of maps going back to the EGAS map that you saw previously on a different website, up to 1828. So essentially filling in the whole cartographic history of London, or at least with a representative map of each sort of generation from the mid-16th century to the period just before the Ordnance Survey. So have the Ordnance Survey drawings, for example. The other one that's notable to talk about is the RAF aerial photography maps, or not maps, but aerial photography, which we collected from Historic England. You might have seen they recently launched their own collection of geocoded images from aerial photography collections. So on their site, you can browse and you can find a pin at the center of, or a square representing each photograph that you click and the photograph opens somewhere else. We worked with volunteers to do georeferencing, of all of the images for Greater London. So we now have a seamless 1946 aerial photograph of the image of the city. Just to give a little indication of the amount of work that was involved in some of that georeferencing. So this is the Roke 1746 map that I've referred to quite frequently. And just to illustrate here, when you zoom right out, you can see how much warping has been involved in making this conform to the modern spatial referencing. Interestingly, you find it's much more accurate in the center and much more warped towards the edges, especially towards the south. Annoyingly for me, particularly around Norwood and towards Dulwich, etc., is particularly warped, purely because Roke was using church towers as his trig points. So famously in the city of London, with 102 parish churches in 1 square mile, he had a lot of trig points, whereas out in the country, he had many fewer. But yes, I mentioned that we had done vectorization work with many of these. So it's very much focusing on that kind of core collection from the 17th century through to the mid-19th century pre-Ordnance Survey. And I gave you a demonstration that you can see another screenshot there. We really focused this work originally on the Roke 1745-46 map, and then used that as a basis to either regress and essentially edit the vectors to suit the earlier epochs that we've got there. So Morgan 1680, Ogilby and Morgan 1676, Faithful and Newcourt 1658. Significant, of course, because that's pre-Great Fire, as well as bringing it forward to 1828. I'll talk about the value of that a little bit later. And here's just a quick illustration of the interface that we used, but with Clocan technology, to do the tracing of the Booth poverty map. So all of the blocks, the housing blocks in different colors, are traced as vectors and available to researchers, thanks to an awful amount of volunteer time doing that online. So just got a few slides now to kind of explore some of the value to historians of using maps in this way, and perhaps then also touching upon the value of that vectorization, which is very labor intensive and maybe not necessarily very attractive to a lot of people, but can be very useful to us. So I've just got one little worked example here, focusing on one particular street in the East End of London. And we're going to start here with a text rather than a map. It's definitely a topographical text. John Stowe's Survey of London. John Stowe is credited with essentially being the first professional historian of London. And he wrote very much from a personal perspective, combining what he found in archives with his own recollections of change. And his book is entirely structured around the parishes and the streets of London as if you're walking those streets, a description of the things that you will find and the history of those things that you would find. So he described Hog Lane, which stretched north from St Mary Spitalfields, without Bishopsgate. Within the last 40 years, it had on both sides fair hedgerows of elm trees, with bridges and easy stiles to pass over into pleasant fields, which was very commodious for citizens therein to walk, shoot, and otherwise recreate and refresh their dulled spirits in the sweet and wholesome air, which is now, within a few years, made a continual building plot throughout, of garden houses and small cottages, and the fields on either side are turned into garden plots, tenter yards, bowling alleys, and such from Houndsditch in the west as far as Whitechapel and further towards the east. So it's quite a vivid description of a space, but how can we map it? Well, we can turn to our first map on Layers of London, our first historical map, which is the Agas map from 1561. We can see the street that he's talking about there, and you can, in fact, see the hedgerows lined with trees. You can see the freakishly large cattle, and in fact, also the people playing archery and things like that, all the things that he describes. 1658, Faithorne New Court, though, the pre-fire map, we can find the same street, and we can see just how dramatic the change was. You can see it's constantly lined, as he described, with quite small houses along the way, but behind them are still quite large gardens. This might now look a little bit more familiar to you that we're talking about Petticoat Lane. So on Morgan's map, 1682, we can see now a much more traditional top-down view of the street, and we can see how a lot of the buildings around here have become much denser, especially on the northeast side of this road. Areas that were garden have been increasingly filled in. Using the vectorization, we can make those comparisons much more clearly. So the green there represents the streets, yards, alleyways from the 1658 map compared with the 1682 map. So just in those few decades, you can see the densification that has occurred. So just using the site, using a few historical maps from the period that I'm most interested in, we can really kind of look in a lot more detail at that process of change and illustrate Stowe's description of change. I'll give a few other examples of analytical uses of the maps. I mentioned earlier on locating London's past, which used the Old Bailey. You can see here an example, so pickpocketing offences plotted onto the map there. This is really the real value of the vectorizing work that we did. So by tracing those features from the map, by fully coding them for their names as represented on the map, we can deal with data from sources about historical phenomena that's described in what we call vernacular ways. So we don't have street numbers. We don't have directories and things for this period. We have descriptions such as on Cheapside in the parish of St Mary le Bow on the left-hand side. By vectorizing all of the data that was on these maps, we can geocode against that data. So we can locate things relatively precisely, often not to individual house level, but by using the intersections of streets and jurisdictions and known buildings, representing the city in the same way that people who lived in the city in the 18th century might have done. So here's a view from ArcGIS in the background, just showing how all of those features are kind of broken down. So one street actually in the vectors that sit behind all this is broken down into all of the elements for each parish that it's in, each ward that it's in, so we can locate those all individually. And that allows us to locate things from a really wide range of sources. This is an example from my own work of a 15th century deed, which describes a property, again, not in terms of address, but in terms of abutments. So it's situated in Crooked Lane in the parish of St Margaret of Bridge Street. That is to say, between the lane called Crooked Lane on one side, etc. So we can use these vernacular descriptions to locate things in the city by having all this vectorized work. And this has allowed me to do a range of interesting things. For example, here, looking at the properties on London Bridge, and in fact, who lived and worked in each one of those properties, famous inhabited London Bridge. We can also apply other methods to it. I don't know if many of you have come across the methodology called space syntax, developed by UCL's Bartlett School. Essentially using sort of spatial logic, thinking in terms of how many turns are required to get from any one place to any other place. Again, so by having the vectors of London in the 17th and 18th centuries, we can apply these modern techniques, modern architectural techniques to look for patterns in the city. So here we can see the brighter the color, the more connected the different streets in the city are. And you can actually see here around St Paul's Cathedral and along Thames Street are the brightest reds, the most highly connected spaces in the city. Unsurprisingly, they were also the highest value spaces, most valued for trade and for shopping. But when we apply the same technique to the 18th century map, Roke's map of 1745/6, we can see quite a different pattern has emerged. There is still some red in the City of London, but there's actually more red and more brighter colours in the West End. You can literally see the centre of gravity of the city moving towards the west. Now we can debate to what extent this is a reflection of reality. It's certainly a model of reality, but being able to apply this to the past city, I think, is really exciting. So the last few slides, I'm going to talk about the community engagement aspects of the project a little bit more. I'm going to touch here just on a concept, a theory, which has been very influential in digital history, digital humanities in the past few years, which is David Bodenhammer's idea of deep maps. The idea that maps don't only convey things through their cartography, but maps can be a container or a gateway into a huge range of other material. This is one of those very woolly academic concepts that I think gets thrown around quite a bit without anyone really knowing quite what they mean by it. So I thought it was quite apt that in Bodenhammer's own introduction to his own book called Making Deep Maps, he begins, its title notwithstanding, this volume contains no instructions for making deep maps, no manuals, no algorithms. We wish it were that easy. But I think a deep map is very much what Layers of London is aspiring to do. We've had all of those map layers I've been talking about, but its equal aim was to map experiences. And that's very much what Bodenhammer and other people who theorize what a deep map might be talk about. They think how we can map the material, how we can map the emotional, how can we use the map as a narrative. And they essentially propose maps in a postmodern form, moving beyond the purely cartographic map to a spatial representation of a far wider range of things than can be represented cartographically. Which, of course, raises the key question of whose narrative, whose emotions, whose feelings, whose memories are we mapping in a deep map? And that's very much the focus for Layers of London. This wasn't a completely new idea from us. In fact, this is one that we picked up from Bristol City Council, who launched a project several years ago called Know Your Place. I think it's a slightly unfortunate title, actually, but obviously helping to get people knowing their place better, which developed the concept of combining historical maps, in this case using the ArcGIS Online platform, with community layers, so pins that were added in that case in quite formal circumstances, but nonetheless by the community to include other things on the map. So that's what we've been trying to do. Especially considering we were funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund, we had to really emphasize this aspect of the project and to think very carefully about how we were going to involve the community, whose memories we were going to capture. So we really aimed to have a user focus throughout the development of the site, and there was lots of testing by community groups, by volunteers throughout the development of the project. We had a very extensive program of active involvement for schools. So not only getting schools to capture the history of their school on the site, but for example, doing that georeferencing of the RAF aerial photography as a school geography lesson task, somewhat disrupted by the lockdown. So that's skills development, working with small organizations, neighborhood organizations to give them digital confidence, especially working with maps and resources like this. And through the process of getting people in a wide range of contexts involved in the site, we hope that we would just help people to better understand their place, know your place, and build pride in their localities. So we did work with about 200 students in the end. That was very heavily curtailed from the targets we had because of lockdown. But we did work with 100 schools in total in form of online teaching for the RAF photography georeferencing. We've now run 4 internships, paid internships attached to the project, and I think many of those people have gone on to work in the archive sector. Run many talks, workshops, walking tours, identifying historical features, walking tours, etc. And in the end, many 20 webinars during the lockdowns, which were very, very popular. Some of the most successful work that we actually did, though, was quite offline, but which we then brought online. So getting people to think in terms again of their experience of their places was made very beautifully visible, I thought, by this project that we did in Camberwell, where we prepared a very large blackboard with a sort of sketch outline map of the neighborhood, and we asked local children to take chalks and to represent their experience of their neighborhood on that map. And that was then photographed and has been georeferenced on the same basis as the other historical maps. So that's now a kind of a key part of the collection. The cartography itself might not be particularly beautiful, but I think it's very meaningful. The trails I mentioned, kind of allowing people to build a narrative with the map, is a particular area where I think we've been very good at engaging with different communities. The first trail that we trialed was Women's History in the East End. And this has been something that now everyone can create their own trail, but has been particularly popular with small community heritage groups to better communicate their local stories. In terms of who we managed to engage with, I think this is perhaps an area where we were particularly affected by lockdown, as well as perhaps optimistic ideas of how many people we'd be able to work with. I think we can certainly say we've succeeded in working beyond traditional local historians. Whether we've reached a diverse enough audience as we might have aspired to might be a different question. But we've certainly engaged with enthusiasts in a load of different aspects of London's life, from pubs to literature to migration stories, and brought them into using historical maps through their community curated collections. We've partnered with a whole load of other voluntary groups, projects, Museum of Youth Culture, Jewish Museum, Everyday Muslims, been a particularly close partner through the Mayor of London's Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm, who have done some amazing work over the past year or two, now using the London 3D map, which used to be at the Building Centre on Store Street and is now in the Guildhall. As an academic project, we obviously had to do evaluation, and people that took part in our activities overwhelmingly, I think, agreed that this project helped them to learn more about their area, to feel that their own stories were being valued. Interestingly, the one which people agreed with least here was learning about my local area has made me feel proud of where I live. And there's a lot more neutrals than agrees on that one, which could be interesting. There's more sort of evaluation thoughts that we've got, and we're now looking to do more map-based projects in the future. So there are lots of learning points for us here, thinking about partnership working and the difficulty of universities working with other types of organization that maybe work on a faster timescale than universities are used to working with biannual committees that have to approve things and stuff like that. Obviously, the tension between wanting to work with end users and with developers was an issue. And we certainly found that aiming to work with historically underrepresented groups was something that we needed to learn more about the way to do that. It took more effort to build trust, for example, with communities than we perhaps anticipated. But I will end by talking about, I think, perhaps the biggest success in what universities now call knowledge exchange terms is our partnership with HUMAP, and the fact that this platform is now available, that was developed through and for us, is now available much more widely and is enabling a much broader range of heritage organizations, city councils, to celebrate and work with their heritage through maps, and that we've built essentially a commercial partnership that supports people to do that. So I think that's certainly a big success. And I will call it a day there. So thank you all very much for paying attention. And of course, very happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. That was a very interesting trip throughout all the information that's there. It's quite a depth of material. So, right, so we're going to move on to the Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions, if you can please put them in the chat, and we'll work our way through them. Okay, so let's glance at the chat right now. So okay, so we've got initially first a comment, then a question. So capturing memory through maps is important. We have worked with schools on mapping place. There's a link in the chat there. Primary schools are key to community involvement. So the question is, what is the level of engagement did layers have with primary schools as the Trojan horse into communities?
Yes, good question. I just tried to look at your website there, meaningfulmaps.org, and I'm afraid it comes up with a WordPress critical error on this website. But hopefully you can resolve that before too long. But it certainly sounds really interesting. I'd love to hear more about that. I think the challenge that we found working with schools and primary schools, perhaps to a slightly lesser extent than secondary schools, was actually just how tightly packed the curriculum is, and how difficult it is to find the time in schools, time with their students, to insert extra things. So I think where we most effectively sort of Trojan horsed into communities to build awareness were actually more through sort of voluntary groups, community associations, community group in Barking called East Side Heritage that sort of do a lot of on the ground work, and by building partnerships with the people leading that group and then running workshops with their members and with local people that they were already kind of connected with. That was a much better way into then finding other people in the Barking neighborhood who were, oh, our school would like to do something about this now that someone that we trust as a kind of local broker has been involved. So I think if we move to new projects, I think we're going to make sure that we employ people who are or have been teachers to develop resources that are very closely integrated into the curriculum to better engage with schools. I think we are perhaps a little bit naive in thinking that we can take things which are broadly thematically aligned into a school and the school will be able to find time. That wasn't quite the success we were imagining. But building partnerships and building sort of trusted brokers, I think, is very much the way. Sometimes teachers were that, but more often it was more Sunday schools than schools, if we kind of use that analogy.
Okay, no, thank you very much for the answer there. Next question we have is the vector data openly accessible?
Yes and no. So the copyright of different elements of these layers is somewhat complex. The Roke 1745/6 map, which was originally developed for the Locating London's Past website, has actually just been made available via Locating London's Past. It's actually the University of Sheffield that own and can therefore give away the copyright for that one. For the other ones I mentioned, for Morgan and the 1828 map, all those other pre-modern maps, or pre-Ordnance Survey maps, where we've got the vector data, we are currently making it available to anyone who asks by email. So layersoflondon@london.ac.uk. We'll make that available to you. We will be putting it onto our institutional repository for anyone to download once we've pulled together all of the documentation for that, which is on the agenda, but it's not quite ready yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question is that do people who contribute have to sign a Creative Commons license?
They do. They have to click an acknowledgement that they agree to anything they share on the website being treated as Creative Commons and shared. With obviously a CC BY, so with acknowledgement attribution for any further sharing, and also that they certify that the thing that they are uploading is theirs to share. The degree to which that is accurate might be is a question that we leave to the community to allow people to report violations, and which we can then remove. People can also report abusive or inappropriate content or anything like that. Remarkably, we've had very, very little abuse in terms of things which have been uploaded, either in terms of copyright or in terms of inappropriate content or malicious content or anything like that. By far, the majority of things people have reported to us have been to say, actually, this photo must have been from 1932 rather than 1936 because the shop closed down in that year or something like that. So yeah, that's most of the stuff reported. But yes, people do have to agree that their content is becoming Creative Commons at the point they upload it.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next one is you've achieved so much. What's next?
Well, we're at very, very early stages of thinking about where we go next. So I can't really kind of say in too much detail. But we're certainly looking to take this approach of bringing together historical maps with a large corpus of data about places, which is geocoded, as a way to facilitate and springboard people researching and then sharing their own histories, to complement one of our other large projects, which is the Victoria County History, which is a project not to write about Victorian history, but it was a project set up as an Jubilee present for Queen Victoria. It was meant to be finished within 7 years. We're about halfway through it now. It's writing history of every parish in England, from Doomsday to the ever moving now, as we describe it. So we've got a huge corpus of place information that we can share, and we would like to use a platform like this to both share that information that we have, which is currently only available in big red books, which you'll only really find in reference libraries, make that available through a map, and again facilitate people sharing their own material and adding to that through a map. So that's the direction we want to take. So that would be all of England.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question we have is, you mentioned the bomb site project. Is that available now through Layers of London?
We have some aspects of it. Other aspects are still only available through bomb site's own website, which has been having problems recently. I haven't checked in the past week or so whether it's working. It was the University of Portsmouth project, from again about 2010 to 2011. I think everyone who is involved in creating it has now moved on from the University of Portsmouth. So that's why there have been problems with maintenance. We are doing our best to try and get that data, but it's getting hold of the people who are involved to give permission for that when they've all moved on to other roles and things like that is a problem. But yes, we would love to make that more accessible. There are other projects which have been inspired by that. So Surrey Heritage Centre, Surrey Archives, have been working on Surrey's equivalent to that. And we're going to hopefully work with them once they've finished that to bring the data for the bits of Surrey, historical Surrey, which are now Greater London, into Layers of London. We do have the bomb maps for Sutton Borough as well, whatever the urban district was previously. So bits and pieces, but no, we don't have that large data set that we would love to have. But again, it's a question of permissions and copyrights and things to get the data.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Always awkward the challenge to try to gather more data, it seems, and especially when people have moved on.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question we have is the vectorization ongoing, and how can people get involved?
Yes, good question. Most of the vectorization was done by MOLA, Museum of London Archaeology, for the pre-19th century maps, and then the Booth poverty map was done using the crowdsourcing tool. We have another map that we would love to share in a similar way and love to vectorize in a similar way, which is valuation survey of Rotherhithe from the 1840s, just at the cusp of the creation of the Surrey docks, and that kind of stuff. Immensely beautiful, detailed map that we've just georeferenced from from Southwark archives. And we've had volunteers transcribe the accompanying register of who owned and the valuation of every single plot. And we're now thinking about how we get those joined and how detailed we go in the vectorization. So if there are willing volunteers to help us with that, that could actually be very welcome. So thank you, and please get in touch.
Okay, no, thank you very much. And if anyone wants to volunteer, your help is more than welcome, it seems. So,
Definitely.
so we've got what at the moment we've got another question here. It's have you considered using linking photos from I've got the website to cartograph.org.uk.
I don't think that's something that's been suggested before. It certainly would be an interesting idea. And the Creative Commons licenses that apply to that, I think, would make that something that might be feasible to do. What we don't have on Layers of London at the moment is the ability to sort of plug in APIs to other services like that on a live basis. We can import things, for example, listed buildings from historic England and stuff like that. But we can't set them up as a live link. That is an aspiration we have for a follow-on project. So that's exactly the kind of thing that the follow-on project I think might be able to set up an API link with other resources like that to bring in data and photos and things like that from other resources.
You okay then? Something, maybe some thoughts for the future.
Mm.
So, one more question we have is have have you access to the land use survey maps, Alice Coleman, from the 1960s for London?
We don't at the moment. We have been the Alice Common ones. I think this something we have been discussing with the Office for National Statistics actually, who I think also have an aspiration to get those maps digitized. Copyright issues, yes, and I think access to the complete collection. There seems lots of people who have got some or most, but very few have all. Yeah, definitely an aspiration. And I think the fact that the ONS are particularly interested in that might give us a way forward to get those eventually. So again, if you want to make contact and help us with that, that would be great.
Okay, no, thank you very much for that
And
then.
David is ahead of me there, I
Oh
see.
yes,
So
yeah, so yes, so yes, David, David Portsmouth just highlighting the fact of I've digitized the land survey use maps on behalf of the ONS. So
I'm
uh,
glad I wasn't misremembering who it was interested. So yeah.
so that'll be very interesting to see. So okay, so I think we've come to the end of the questions. So it's been a very interesting talk and very interesting topic. So thank you for sharing that. And I I think everyone well what I can see in the chat, people are more than very happy to hear very happy with what we've heard. So
Excellent. Thank you all very much. It's been interesting, great to talk to a different audience, non-historians.
yes, well, so subtly different audience here, and no, I'm sure you'll find some enthusiastic volunteers to maybe assist you, and
Yeah,
if anyone wants to if anyone wants to reach out, I'm sure Justin would be more than happy to more than happy to talk to you on any assistance or thoughts you have.
yeah, easily Googleable.
Okay,
Okay,
so I'd just like to bring the talk to a close then. So I want to say to our audience, thank you for joining us today. Uh, Justin, I want to say thank you for the talk. Genuinely very interesting and had always something always good to hear these fairly large projects and give them the give a bit more wider audience for them to look at. So no, thank you very much for that. I want to
thank
say.
you.
Mhm. So I want to say to everyone, thank you for joining us, and we hope that you'll join us next time for another Teatime talk. So our next talk will be another in our Mapping My World series. But for today, we'd like to say thank you and goodbye.